Hi, I'm Emily Previti of the Pennsylvania Capital Star and host of Folo PA. Our podcast focused on policy affecting Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. State lawmakers passed the 2026-27 budget within 2 weeks of the deadline, which is June 30th. So it was late, but closer to on time than usual in recent decades, including last year, when negotiations dragged on for 135 days. We don't have to go through that again this summer, but the final budget session was a bit of a marathon, with some late nights and working through the weekend, before Governor Josh Shapiro signed it on a Sunday evening. My colleagues were there covering it. Peter Hall, Ian Carble, Whitney Downard, and Emily Skolnick, our 2026 Dow Jones News Fund reporting intern. Everyone, thank you so much for making time to be here. I was not at the Capitol or working during this final budget negotiating session. I was actually away, and I have to say, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I thought it didn't matter because we had just gone through last year 3 months of will they, won't they sessions scheduled every day without any action, as Pete and Ian might recall, timekeeping at press conferences, and we were the last state in the country without one, eventually. So, Pete, you've covered more budgets than any of us. When was it clear to you that this weekend session looked like it wasn't merely performative, but maybe legitimate as far as there being action that warranted coverage at minimum?
Well, I wasn't actually at the Capitol during the final 2 days of the process myself. I'd been out on a reporting trip, so Whitney and Ian took pity on me, but I was watching and contributing from home. And there's always a build-up in the weeks before the budget actually passes when you speak to folks like Jordan Harris, the House Appropriations Chairman, or the leaders. You try to get some intelligence on what's going on in the closed-door negotiations. They play it very close to the vest. Usually progresses from just negotiations are ongoing to we should have something in a few days to make sure you're here tomorrow. This year, especially when the House and Senate called sessions on Saturday afternoon and Sunday evening, that's when I think it was clear that they were serious about finishing it.
Ian?
I would add there was an optimism when lawmakers were talking about it that was really absent at this time last year, and especially talking to lobbyists who were following issues and who work with lawmakers to try to get things in the budget. They kept saying, this isn't going to be last year. We think we can get this close to on time. And that was even before the deadline. I mean, people really thought it could be on time. It was fairly close. And I would say the other thing is it was an election year, and I don't think anyone wanted a budget impasse dragging out to November again when there would be an election this year.
I actually ran the numbers on that. In non-election years, it takes 3 times as long to get it passed, on average. All right. There's a lot in the budget, and we will get into some specific coverage and questions that have already come up in the stories that we've done. But how do you prioritize what you look into and which stories to tell?
One of the things is really focus on something that we've covered before. A few of us have gone to rallies where specific groups have asked for an increase in funding. It's always pretty easy to follow up and see, hey, did this group get any more funding? Were they flat funded? And then really just looking at our own beats and what we focus on. And sometimes I just read a few extra paragraphs just to see if anything odd pops out to me or something weird that I've never heard of to follow up on later.
Yeah, I think when the budget passes itself, like that weekend is just chaos and you're trying to make sure that you get the big picture right. This budget's $50.8 billion. What are the top line items? Are there any major new policies that come out of that? That really comes from having watched and talked to lawmakers leading up to it. What are they saying are the sticking points and all of that stuff, and really just following those issues across. And then I think it's really helpful to just read the budget. I mean, it's like hundreds of pages of legalese, but really interesting stories pop out of that. And then, like Whitney said, going to your sources and saying, hey, is there anything in this budget that you're watching? Did anything affect you? And of course, your sources are on the beats that you follow?
I think it's important to add that the budget isn't just money and numbers. It is a lot of what they call black letter law that goes into it as really bargaining chips. The different priorities the caucuses have are used as essentially bargaining chips to get what they want into the budget. So we track those by issue. There's usually a few attempts at passing legislation, so there may be multiple bills out there. They very often end up in the budget and become law that way.
Understood. So, Emily, this is your first state budget. How did you decide what to focus on? As Whitney mentioned, there are events and rallies and lots of groups wanting lots of things. And so even in that context, there's a lot to choose from. So you gravitated, it seemed like, towards some of the education stuff. There's a lot of money in education. I don't know if that was the poll or what.
Yes, this was my first state budget, and it came in the middle of my internship with you all. And a lot of what I chose to pursue in follow-ups came from stories I've worked on. For example, one of the things was cyber charter funding that I'd written a story on last month, and so I was just seeing how that all ended up panning out. And as someone who just graduated from college and did student journalism, education is something that I'm familiar with, even if not quite as much the K through 12 side of things. The education sector itself is something I think I know pretty well, so it's interesting to me to see how the state handled it this time around.
We're going to jump a little bit around. Pete, you referenced this when you were talking about how you decide what to focus on, and that's code bills. Can you just sort of expand on that and explain for people who don't know or maybe think they kind of know exactly what they are, since we're going to talk about them throughout the conversation?
The budget, we speak of it as a singular thing, but it's actually a number of pieces of legislation that get passed every year. The code bills are companion bills that essentially tell the state government how to spend the money that they're getting. It's instructions on how to run their department. So you have a tax code bill, which can contain changes in the way that the state collects taxes, and there wasn't actually a tax code bill this year, I believe, because there were no new taxes, no changes to the tax code. There was an education code bill, which Emily went through with a fine-tooth comb, and then there's the fiscal code, which is a catch-all where we often see the legislation that may be part of that horse trading I was talking about before during budget negotiations. This may be a bill that is stalled in one chamber or the other, and say the House Democrats really want to get the number for education funding up where they want it to be, and they may offer to pass a Senate Republican bill as part of the fiscal code to get that budget number that they want. We often see a lot of things tucked into that fiscal code that they're very often last-minute additions.
Governor Josh Shapiro in February proposed his budget, and that initially passed the State House of Representatives. That was $53.2 billion. And the final product is $2.4 billion less than that. So where did that come from? How do we get to 50.8, which is still up 1.4% from last year, but it's not as much as what was introduced?
I would also note there that being up 1.4% means it's actually down relative to inflation.
Yes. So, I came across a story by Jackson White from Spotlight PA explaining something called a cycle roll. And it actually, Whitney, is going to probably be something that you would look at because of the types of expenses that it's dealing with. So do you want to take a crack at explaining it?
Yeah, sure thing. So I actually do have to note that this was something that several of the Republicans who voted against the bill mentioned. Somebody compared it to cooking the books, like infamous mobster Al Capone, and another person called it voodoo math. So really what they're doing is they're basically just delaying when they pay these bills by, I think it's 2 months. And so instead of paying their bills to these managed care organizations, who are the ones who act kind of as the coordinator of services for insurance. So if you are on Medicaid under the state, you're actually covered by this managed care organization who's paid by the state to take care of that. So the Department of Human Services is just going to be delaying those payments. I think it was $1.3 billion. And so that fell off of this current fiscal year and would actually be pushed into the next fiscal year. This was something that we'd done before. This wasn't new. We just kind of caught up during COVID, and then now we're back to pushing those payments back again. It's an accounting maneuver. It's not illegal. It's not, you can kind of feel whatever way you want about it, but it's something that they're hoping will shift the expenses back so that way they could get that number down to $50.8 billion this year.
And it could all work out in terms of minimizing negative impacts if, for example, some of the revenue generators that we've been talking about for quite a while come to fruition, such as skill games, which now there's a court order that the legislature has to figure that out, or legalizing recreational marijuana, which is longer of a shot, to say it succinctly. And so if that revenue starts generating, then in theory we have that $2 billion that Shapiro was estimating we could get. But essentially it's like a household or an individual looking at your budget for the year and deciding, okay, well, I'm just going to not pay my utility bill on time because I can maybe get away with that or something.
Yeah, and from what I understand, it doesn't look like there's going to be any sort of penalty, but that there is a risk if 2 months from now, I'm actually broke and I can't pay this and it's already 2 months late. So it's got a risk attached, but I don't believe there is much of a penalty. And these managed care organizations have ginormous contracts with the state, and we've been working together for years. So they know the bill will get paid. It just looks like it's going to be a little late.
Okay. Was this a rush job? It was relatively on time, as we've said, compared to some recent years. Happened within 2 weeks of the deadline.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word rush job, though I could see why people would think that. It was more just like everyone saying we're going to put off the more complicated things that we have to get into until later. Things like skill games, even though there is a deadline hanging over the state, but they still have a few more months on that. Things like cannabis, and a bigger question of where is our revenue going to come from if we want to spend more money. A lot of big questions that would result in either revenues going up or spending going down. Things like, hey, are we going to reconsider the funding formula or adequacy formula for schools? All got pushed away. So whether you'd call that a rush job or just sort of setting a table for a very complicated next year or next couple years, I don't know.
Last year, the state budget impasse affected pass-through payments to counties, to community service organizations, to schools. And if we're focusing on skill games and saying, okay, we know it's going to take a while to hash that out, so to leave the budget undone to see what that revenue is going to be, you can understand perhaps not wanting to drag out for that reason. All right, we've been talking about skill games. And so for Pete and or Anne, because I know you guys have done the most coverage on this topic, we'll probably be doing a sit down together again to talk about that. But for now, what was expected to happen and what ended up actually happening? Similar deal with data centers. What was expected to happen? Did anything happen? Even if it was indirectly related, such as with energy.
The General Assembly has been very focused on data centers and energy affordability session. Among many other pieces of legislation that made it into that fiscal code bill that I was talking about, there were 3 dealing with energy affordability and data centers. One of them would require greater oversight of the forecasts that electric utilities use to essentially see how much electricity is going to be used on peak days in years down the road. And the way they do those forecasts is that PJM Interconnection, the nonprofit that manages Pennsylvania's and 12 other states' energy grid and energy supplies, they just go to their local utilities and say, hey, who has come to you and said they want to connect to the grid in your territory? The utilities provide that to PJM. They come up with a total subject to formulas and the mathematics that I don't understand. This law in the fiscal code would require utilities to also share that information with the Public Utilities Commission, which regulates all the water, gas, and electric utilities and some other things like taxis and railroads to an extent. But they would be able to look at that and vet PJM's work. There's another piece of legislation that requires data center owners to report annually on their energy and water use. And the third piece of energy-related legislation in the code requires utilities basically to prove to the Public Utilities Commission that they have explored whether they can employ any advanced transmission technologies before they build new power lines, and the cost of which would be passed along to ratepayers or people who get an electric bill. Advanced transmission technologies, it's a broad term covering anything that improves the efficiency of the grid. For example, composite power lines, which have a core that is made out of fiber instead of steel, that provides the structural strength of the power line, but it doesn't heat up. And when power lines heat up, they increase resistance, and that's how up to 5% of the electricity produced in the U.S. gets lost in transmission.
I feel like that was just a real reflection of how frustrated constituents are with their power prices, and lawmakers were responding to that by trying to do something.
One thing that was not in the budget that the House Democrats and Republicans passed with strong bipartisan support was the elimination of the gross receipts tax that utilities pay on the electricity they sell, and they passed that along to their customers. The House amended a bill to include this elimination of the tax, which they billed as the largest tax cut in state history, about $1.7 billion that would be directly passed on to consumers through reductions in their electricity bills. That didn't make it in, I think, largely because there was nowhere else to get that revenue from. And we've talked about some of the new revenue sources that Governor Shapiro had proposed in his budget plan that didn't make it, the skill games and adult use marijuana. They could have covered that, but that just wasn't in the cards this year.
So to pivot from those issues, Emily, the education code bill that you've been focused on, that includes mandatory recess, it includes awareness/prevention of eating disorders, cyberbullying, and more curriculum to address that. So a couple of things, you can get into some of the details, but I was surprised, I don't know if you were surprised, that some of the cyberbullying data reporting and procedure was not already a thing. Was your sense that it's already happening and widespread, but this is a push to standardize or universalize?
I haven't looked at specific statistics on how widespread it is, but I do think part of it was the legislature recognizing that it is 2026 and we're in a very digital era and a very social media focused era, especially for kids who are in school right now. And I feel like especially since the pandemic, when so much of everything is on social media. Not that it wasn't before, but it became so much more of a thing during that time because it was all people could do. But they needed to put something in there to address it, and they didn't expand the definition of bullying, but the cyberbullying terminology and procedures were just inserted in the same sections of the code that address and prevent and penalize bullying in schools. So I think it was just a way for them to address it on a widespread level and make sure that schools are doing what they need to do and districts are doing what they need to do to address issues that come up in their schools. Similarly, they put in some protections against AI deepfakes in the social media section, which again is a reflection of the technological space we're in and how students are using that tech and AI especially as they're moving through school. So I don't know if it was a push to standardize it, but I think it was a push to make sure that districts are looking at how their students are using social media and tech and AI. And so it's clear they've done something about it or tried to.
And then mandatory recess, K through 5. Shapiro and the legislators, when them talking about this, did they say anything about what the deal is in other states with having these rules? Did they say anything about it becoming a trend as far as getting rid of it? or emphasizing it? Or what were you hearing as far as impetus in the discussion about that?
It was one of the things Shapiro talked about in his budget address. It's an example of a priority in the school code this year being on student well-being and safety. And in his budget address, he talked about how students need time outside and they need a break from learning. And from what I can find, as of the 2024-25 school year, only 10 states had mandatory recess. So other states are definitely putting in this type of thing, but it's not, I wouldn't call it widespread yet. But I think the fact that it made it into the school code can definitely be considered a win for Shapiro, because he's been emphasizing it along with free breakfast and other things. And I think the focus on well-being can be seen in also the eating disorder awareness programs that they're starting and making sure people are educated on the signs and causes. And the House Education Committee has also been really focused on efforts to keep students safe and enjoying their time at school. So I think the recess thing is just another part of that.
So is the eating disorders awareness and prevention push more long overdue, in need of an update, or, you read about weight loss drugs becoming a thing and maybe people who don't need them for medical reasons taking them? And was it related to a cultural moment that we might unfortunately be in or reverting back to? What was the discussion around that?
Yeah, there was nothing. The eating disorder section, at least from what I know, was completely new. Part of it is, unfortunately, I think a time we're living in, again, with social media and kids seeing people and things on social media that they might want to try to attain, but it's not necessarily healthy for them to do that. But yeah, so the Department of Education now has to work with the Department of Health to offer annual eating disorder awareness education to middle and high school students, and also make that stuff available to families, and just making sure that kids are being kept safe. Update those guidelines and procedures every 5 years.
Okay, so a little bit more on education, but this one for Ian. You are working on a story that looks at the 4 districts this year that are getting the most money, adequacy funding in particular. So can you explain a bit more about that?
I showed up here in Pennsylvania as a reporter in 2024, and in every budget that I covered, there have been these provisions in the school code bill that I found a little strange, that basically say, hey, we're going to give however many millions of dollars to a school district in a county of the second class, that's just an example, with between, just making this up, 2,000 and 2,005 students in the 2021-2022 school year. And that to me seemed really strange, because it's like, that is a specific school district. There's no way that can apply to more than one. And this is a weird way of writing, we are giving money to this school district. And the reason that I found that particularly interesting is, like, one, whenever there's something in a budget like that, like, hey, we're just going to give money to this one person or this one group or this one school district, whatever it is, that's worth reporting on. And especially because since I've gotten here, how we fund our school districts in Pennsylvania has been such a big discussion. 2024 was the year that there was the big overhaul where lawmakers rolled out adequacy funding, which it will add $4.5 billion by the end of 9 years. So it's, there's been a lot of fighting over how we fund schools. And basically for the last 3 years, every single school code has included this little provision that's like, we're giving money to this very specific school district or these very specific school districts. And when I've reported on them, they have always been represented by Democrats, particularly in the state house, though mostly also in the state senate, and then include school districts in the districts of very powerful members of the House Democratic Party, like Speaker Joanne McClinton. Last year, the money that went to just a single school district was for the William Penn School District, which was in her district. And so this year, reading through the school code, there were 4 school districts that there were individual paragraphs giving money to. There's the Muhlenberg School District in Berks County, the Whitehall-Coplay School District in Lehigh County, the Morrisville-Burrell School District in Bucks County, and the Sealton Heights-Spire School District in Dauphin County. And so I've been looking at why every year there are these school districts that get extra money. It's important to note that in 2024 in particular, there was a lot of fighting over how we do this adequacy funding, which is what is the formula that gives the most needy school districts in Pennsylvania more money. How do we decide that? And there was a big fight between Democrats and Republicans over how they measured poverty in school districts, which remains a factor in the adequacy formula. And Democrats wanted to use this measure that school districts themselves did through a survey. Republicans wanted to use U.S. Census Bureau data. And basically what was measured by the school districts resulted in a lot more money going out. What was measured by the Census Bureau would have resulted in less. Democrats said theirs was more accurate. Republicans said that theirs prevented school districts from being able to fudge the numbers. And ultimately, Republicans won that. And so Initially, a lot of the school districts that got the money were from Democrats who said, hey, our version of the funding formula would have given our school districts a lot more money, and you're not going to get my vote unless you find a way to make that whole. And they really needed every vote. So that is how the first batch of school districts got this money. William Penn, last year, it was a school that was facing real financial issues. And it was very important to Speaker McClinton that this school district in her district be given enough money to survive and not have to fire a ton of teachers and cut a bunch of programmings. And it's a similar thing that's happening this year. There's these 4 school districts. All of them are struggling. They are all facing very difficult decisions, and their lawmakers went to bat for them. And so there are carve-outs in the school code that give them money outside of the way any other school district is funded. And what's interesting is that Democrats will say that's because we fight for our school districts. That's why these get this extra money. Some Republicans say, well, you don't see us asking for money outside of these. We stick with what we get, and we make sure that our school districts are kept accountable. If they're not spending their money well, then we're going to make them figure out how to deal with that. And then there's this third group of experts who look in from the outside. They see there's all these school districts getting money, and the question that it raises for them is, if this funding formula is so fair, and why are these schools still struggling, and why do we have to give them extra money? Maybe we should be giving everyone more money, or if it's just Democratic school districts that are getting this money, are there not school districts represented by Republicans that need it too? It's sort of this big open question, and I keep reporting on it because every year some school districts keep getting more money.
Whitney, speaking of more funding increases, you reported this week on funding that doubled for rape crisis centers, which is a big change from what they went through last year. That's $24 million up from $12 million, and we've referenced last year's budget impasse and it dragging out payments to community service organizations such as rape crisis centers, getting held up eventually and causing all kinds of issues. So what was the fear that you were hearing about, specifics about what could happen based on what went on last year if negotiations dragged on again? And then to see funding double after that, I was curious about what may have changed behind the scenes or what kind of work you saw going on leading up to this.
Yeah, so, that 135-day impasse delayed $530 million in payments to these community organizations such as rape crisis centers. The Rape Crisis Center in Philadelphia actually laid off nearly 3/4 of its staff because it was so delayed that they just didn't have the funds to pay their own advocates. A couple other centers also had to make these tough choices of layoffs and cutting services. And they really just came to the legislators this year and said, hey, we need more money to recover from that. We haven't gotten our staffing levels back up. These are jobs that often don't pay as much as you could get working at a Sheetz or a Wawa. And often these are positions that require a master's degree, and there are counseling aspects and second-degree trauma of sorts. So I think that they really just said, hey, we need this money. We need it now. And that's what pushed a lot of lawmakers. I mean, Shapiro actually cited a personal visit he made to Pittsburgh in his budget speech after he signed it, or prior to his signature. He was like, I was really moved by this visit. So I think that they really just made the pitch and they sold it.
Advocates mentioned to you that some additional funding could support expanding prevention services. Did they give examples of what that might look like?
I think that really depends on the organization and what their connection to the community looks like. In some rural areas that they actually have been doing some sort of teen intervention where they educate teens on what exactly to look for. What does a healthy relationship look like? How do you give consent? How do you have your consent respected? And what does it look like when somebody's not respecting it? And what is a red flag? This is just some important preventative education that really is the first thing cut when you don't have funds. And it's really hard to measure the impact of preventative education like this. So those are the types of services that these agencies might be able to really expand on, but much focus is going to be how do we get the pay up so that way our advocates stay and they're actually getting a livable wage.
Another question for you. You've covered budget negotiations before at the state level, but not here. And I had grand plans to pull on my reporting from last year as far as anything structural that might be different in Indiana, and I did not do that. So I guess I didn't need to, because you would know that, having lived both. So
yeah, I can give a little context.
So you can just, what are the differences?
Yeah, well, Toto, I don't think we're in Indiana anymore. So Indiana does it really differently. They have a 2-year budget. They only spend $45 billion for those 2 years. So their budget is much smaller than Pennsylvania's. Their population is smaller than Pennsylvania's. And it's a Republican trifecta, so they don't have these negotiations. Everyone's pretty much on the same page from the get-go. And I've never covered a late budget. But Pennsylvania also has some laws or rules that make it a little easier to have a late budget. Legislators are still paid. Agencies continue to function. Nothing screeches to a grinding halt immediately when there's a late budget. So I just think there's a lot less pressure to get it done before a deadline. And Indiana has always been one that prides itself on not having a structural deficit. In Pennsylvania, the Independent Fiscal Office has been flagging that structural deficit for years. And they were worried that some of Shapiro's proposals would actually dip into the rainy day fund too much and deplete it within just a few years. So these are two states that just function completely differently. It was pretty interesting experience to cover them both.
Yeah, it sounds like they're quite different in many ways, which we'll continue to come back to in future episodes, I'm sure of it. Okay, so back to Emily. One piece you focused on is the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, referred to as PASHE. And there are a couple of things. Tuition is going up by a significant amount overall, and more than it has in quite some time, because there were some years where there was a freeze, which you can get into. But there's some flat funding happening. So can you tell us a little bit more about what happened there?
So the state system froze its tuition between 2018 and 2024, which did include the pandemic. Tuition wasn't increased as inflation grew, which eventually caused some issues when the state system did not get an increase in funding this year. They initially requested a $651 million appropriation from the state in October, but their final line item is $625 million, which required them to raise tuition this year. The increase because of that is larger than it's been since before that freeze happened, but PASHE is still the lowest tuition rate in the state, and that rate is the same across its 10 schools.
At the same time, they announced the PASHE pledge. We're raising tuition, but maybe not everybody has to worry about it. It was just, the timing was interesting and a little confusing. So you're like, okay, well, what is the point if you're going to cover these costs? So what was the pledge? What were the details around that?
The pledge, they will cover remaining tuition costs for students who receive both state grants to cover part of tuition and federal Pell Grants. So it's designed to help people who are still struggling even after both that federal and state assistance. Shapiro's talked a lot about investing in higher ed, and I think this is another example of a program designed to help students enter college and stay in college and graduate from college, because PASHE schools also contribute a lot to the state's workforce, which there's been a decline of working people with secondary degrees in recent years. Part of this is just trying to make sure that people are able to have the resources and have the support to, if they want to pursue higher education, they're able to do that.
Ian, PBMs. You flag some changes that'll make it harder for pharmacy benefits managers to kick pharmacies out of their networks. You are our resident expert on this issue. It seems like it might help struggling pharmacies, but not necessarily. So where do you come down on that, or what do you have to look at to decide whether it's helpful or harmful?
I think first, explain PBMs. They are the middlemen to end all middlemen in the pharmaceutical supply chain. So think of them as sitting between insurance companies, drug manufacturers, and pharmacies, and they interact with all three. They are hired by insurance companies to handle all the prescription drug sides of their plans, and that means they make the formulary list of what drugs are covered by your insurance plan. But in making that formulary, that's where they also work with drug manufacturers, and so they negotiate with them to get drugs on that list. Supposedly, that lowers costs for consumers, and if you're dealing with Medicaid, it lowers costs for the state and everyone else. But it also means they're getting kickbacks from drug manufacturers in exchange for covering their products. And now, basically, if a pharmacy wants to take your insurance, they have to sign a contract with your PBM. And pharmacies, like just about any other store, they buy their own products that they then sell to you. So all the medication they have in stock, they purchase that from a wholesaler. And when you pick up a prescription and you have no copay or a very small copay because of your insurance, it's a PBM that reimburses that pharmacy for everything else. Pharmacists say those reimbursements have been getting smaller and smaller to the point that they're hard to stay in business, but they still have to deal with those PBMs anyway. And the reason that they say they have to deal with those PBMs anyway is you have to understand these massive companies. There's 3 PBMs, they're known as the big 3, that handle roughly 80% of all covered prescription claims in the country. So basically, if a pharmacist says, hey, we don't like the terms of the contract you gave us, you're not reimbursing us enough money, a PBM can say, fine, well, we're going to take you out of our network. And now a huge portion of your customers, depending on where you live, it can be half or more, may no longer be able to use their insurance at your pharmacies. And so that's where PBMs have a lot of power over pharmacies. And that is what this provision is intended to address. Some pharmacists have accused PBMs of arbitrarily kicking them out of their network. Maybe it's because they argued too much about the way they were being reimbursed. Maybe it's just because the PBM didn't like the way that they were filing paperwork and things were taking too long and they were just difficult to deal with. And basically what this provision says is it allows pharmacies to fight that. So I think it's like 12 months after a pharmacy is kicked out of a PBM's network, they now legally have to be able to go back to the PBM and say, okay, take me back. And the PBM is supposed to do that, or at least consider that. I think whether or not this is effective, time will tell. Lawmakers have passed laws in an attempt to rein them in to help pharmacies that are closing at a very rapid pace across the state to help them stay open. And it just hasn't really worked. They're huge companies. They have huge legal teams. And they are these very complicated companies that are really hard to wrap your brain around. So they're really hard to regulate in effective ways. So we'll see.
Pete, briefly, we'll come back to you before we wrap up. There were a couple of items from State Senator Gene Yaw, a Republican from Lycoming County, on energy. So briefly, what are those 2 things that were wrapped into this budget?
Yaw is the Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee chairman, so he has a big say in the state's energy policy. And his district hosts a base of operations for the fracking industry. And so he had 2 bills that were included, again, in the fiscal code bill, that, well, they instruct the Department of Environmental Protection to modernize the rules for what's called unconventional drilling, which is what's used in fracking. This would allow gas producers to reach below the Marcellus Shale, which is the rock formation far underground that has been fueling the natural gas boom in Pennsylvania for the last 20 years or so. This would allow these gas drillers to reach down into the Utica Shale formation, which is another source of natural gas. And Yaw says that this would allow companies to develop this source of natural gas, which is in high demand for electricity and all kinds of things. There is a push to export more of Pennsylvania's natural gas, so this would encourage that.
There were some protest votes in the state Senate from both sides. Whitney, I know that you touched on what was at the root of, or in part, what was at the root of what the Republicans were saying as their reasons for voting against. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
All the Republicans were pretty upset about who spoke. All of them cited that cycle role in pushing those payments back. But for the Democrats, it was really the digital ad tax.
Right. Okay. So yes, the Democrats had different reasons. And Ian?
The digital ad tax was an idea floated by some Democratic lawmakers to basically expand the state's gross receipts tax to cover digital advertisements. And it specifically targeted very large companies like Meta, Google, some of the biggest companies in the entire country, and saying, if you're going to serve ads in Pennsylvania, we're going to tax you for it. There was a lot of controversy over whether or not that should pass. A number of lawmakers, mostly Republicans, said, well, this is going to be passed on to our small businesses that advertise on those platforms. But the lawmakers that were in support of it really felt like it could bring in a ton of money. I think the figure, I would have to pull up my own story here. I think it was like $500 million a year. Pete, do you remember that number?
I do not off the top of my head. I think it was more than that.
329 million is what I'm reading from the Department of Revenue estimate.
So yes, there were various estimates that put it between 329 million and like 600 million. But it was roughly around $500 million was the number the lawmakers used. And when you were facing a structural deficit, this was an extremely popular plan with a certain part of the Democratic Party who felt that we should be taxing the largest companies in this country who may not be incorporated in Pennsylvania, may not even have a ton of workers in Pennsylvania, but are used by millions of Pennsylvanians.
I mean, that's a very specific budgetary item that it is a more relevant answer than what I was thinking about, which is Nikhil Saval from Philadelphia and Katie Muth from Montgomery County. They're Democrats, and they were talking about affordable housing and transportation as some of their reasons for voting against. So I don't know if you want to say any more about what specifically they wanted to see or thought they could see, or was this just more of a general?
Yeah, I believe Saval's quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, was something along the lines of, this is a budget that defers those big policy questions, and my constituents do not want us to defer them. They want us to just tackle them. And this was just not a budget that wrestled with some of those larger policy questions, like housing, like transportation. I'm currently working on a story about what exactly did happen for housing under this budget, and the answer is not a lot. One of the biggest items was the Critical Infrastructure Fund, which actually would have been funded through general obligation bonds, which is a form of debt. And that was really the biggest line item for housing, and it was struck because we're not taking on more debt right now. So I think that's kind of something that's frustrating people, is what are we going to do on this front to actually get people into more homes? And transportation, last year they struck a 2-year deal to keep transportation going in the meantime, but there's a lot of disagreement about how much that should be funded and how it should be funded.
I would put in one more thing that was brought up in protest that I think Pete...
I was going to talk about this if...
Food processing.
Yeah. Katie Muth was one of the Democratic no votes, and she spent a lot of time this session dealing with data centers, one in her district and I think 2 right on the borders of her district. So she had proposed a moratorium bill, and then also legislation to stop data centers from becoming utilities like the electric company, which would give them all kinds of powers. She was critical of the budget for not doing enough to help local officials deal with that. But she also spent a big chunk of her speech on the floor voicing her opposition for another measure that was tucked into the fiscal code. That is to give the DEP and the Department of Agriculture the exclusive authority to regulate the use of food processing residuals, which is essentially sludge from slaughterhouses on farm fields. This legislation preempted all other regulation. Muth said that takes control away from local governments and the people who have to live around and smell the farms that use this material.
As someone who lived in Lancaster for a time, that sounds like a good idea. Okay, nobody thinks it's funny.
No, that was good. You should keep that.
It's funny. Thank you guys so much for taking the time. I know that there's a lot of this we'll be coming back to in future episodes as our coverage continues throughout the year. You've been listening to Folo PA, Pennsylvania Capital Stars podcast focused on how policy affects Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd like what you've heard, we'd love it if you'd recommend it to a friend. To stay updated on the newest episodes and other work by our team, you can subscribe to the Capital Stars newsletter, The Morning Guide, at penncapital-star.com, and we've included that link in our show notes. Our theme music is Dusk by Mr. Smith, courtesy of the Free Music Archive, licensed under an Attribution 4.0 international license. Folo PA is edited by the Capital Star's Editor-in-Chief Tim Lambert, and it's hosted and produced by me, Emily Previti. Thanks for listening.